What would you do if someone handed you a sealed book, told you it held the secret to keeping your feet clean, and then sent you off to war? That is precisely how this story begins, with an absurd little pamphlet, a king's shilling pressed into an open palm, and a young man who had no earthly idea that he was about to stumble into one of the most closely guarded technological marvels of the 20th century. December of 1939 was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeps through wool and settles deep in the bones, and it was in that merciless chill that I raised my right hand inside the territorial drill hall on Deansbrook Road in Edgware, northwest London, and swore myself into service as a sergeant wireless instructor in the Royal Artillery. Could I have imagined, standing there among strangers in that drafty hall, that radar, a word I had never even heard whispered, would soon become the axis around which my entire wartime existence would spin? Not a chance. The attesting officer who administered the oath had a dry, perfunctory manner, and his parting gift was that little book, delivered with a straight face and not a trace of irony. The promise on its pages was hygiene. The reality waiting beyond those doors was something else entirely. A plunge into invisible electromagnetic waves, rotating antennae, and the frantic race to spot enemy aircraft before they dropped their bombs. History has a peculiar sense of humor, and mine began with clean feet and ended with secrets that could have tilted the outcome of an entire global conflict. That same drill hall on Deansbrook Road carried its own small legend. It was the very place where the writer Godfrey Wynne had enlisted in the Navy as an ordinary seaman before enduring the nightmare of the Murmansk convoy PQ-17, a harrowing ordeal he later immortalized in his book PQ-17, a volume that still deserves a place on any serious reader's shelf. And so the stage was set, though none of the actors yet knew their parts. Without the faintest suspicion of what lay ahead, I had volunteered myself into a role that would peel back the curtain on radar technology, a system so secret that most of Britain's own soldiers had never heard its name. The irony cut even deeper when you consider that, by that point in the war, the Germans already possessed radar equipment superior to ours. We were running to catch up with an enemy who, in many technical respects, was already a stride ahead. The knowledge that our detection capabilities lagged behind those of the Luftwaffe added a quiet urgency to every lesson I would later teach, every cathode ray tube I would learn to read, and every operator I would try to mold into someone capable of saving lives with a flickering green line on a dark screen. By early 1940, the machinery of national defense was lurching into motion with all the grace of a rusted engine turning over for the first time in years. The regular army, its best units shipped across the Channel as the British Expeditionary Force, was stretched impossibly thin, and what remained at home was, in blunt terms, the fag end, a skeleton crew of veterans supplemented by a tidal wave of eager but untrained territorial army volunteers. The authorities were constructing a vastly expanded fighting force almost from scratch, and the simple truth is that novices were running the show at nearly every level. Decisions were made on instinct and prayer. Supplies arrived late or not at all. That Britain survived this period at all was nothing short of a miracle. A testament not to any grand strategy but to the stubborn refusal of ordinary people to accept defeat. Anti-aircraft defense across the United Kingdom fell squarely on the shoulders of the Territorial Army, which formed the backbone of the wartime expansion. For me personally, this arrangement carried a peculiar consequence. I was never permitted to settle with the unit to which I officially belonged. Instead, I was perpetually attached to some other formation, shuffled from one posting to the next like a playing card dealt from hand to hand. Dover, Who in Kent, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, London. Each name on the map became a brief chapter in a restless odyssey. I was, in effect, a one-man stage army, moved around the country perhaps to create the illusion that our radar capability was larger and more robust than it truly was. Wherever I landed, my task remained the same: train radar operators and train them fast, because the sky would not wait for us to be ready. My first posting deposited me at Dover, and more specifically at Swingate Camp, perched to the east of the town on those famous white cliffs. There I was attached to the 88th Heavy Anti-Aircraft Battery, a territorial army unit that presented an almost comical picture of wartime improvisation. Although the battery was manned and equipped for 8 guns, it possessed only 4. The arithmetic was brutal in its simplicity. Half the men worked the guns while the other half were dispatched to plow the surrounding fields, week on, week off, an alternating rhythm of war and agriculture that belonged more to the Middle Ages than to a modern conflict. As the expansion of the army gathered pace, that spare half eventually peeled away to form the cadres of entirely new units scattering across the country like seeds from the very fields they had tilled. The men of the 88th had been raised from territorial army volunteers drawn from Dover and the surrounding countryside, mobilized at the outbreak of hostilities. Yet months into the war, they still found themselves within easy walking distance of their hometown, carrying on almost as though peacetime routines had never been interrupted. Every afternoon, with clockwork regularity, a bus rolled up to Swingate Camp to collect a 24-hour leave party and ferry them into Dover for an evening of familiar comforts. It must have felt, to those who lived it, like the coziest imaginable way of going to war, a conflict experienced at arm's length, with the warmth of home never more than a short ride away. Into this comfortable arrangement, I arrived like a cuckoo forcing its way into a nest already crowded with contented birds. My very presence was an unwelcome signal that the leisurely rhythm of life at Swingate was about to change. I represented something the men did not want to think about, the reality that a genuine war was gathering force just across the channel, and that new, bewildering technology was about to complicate their world. The gadget I carried knowledge of, a device capable of detecting aeroplanes at distance through invisible waves, was yet another disruption to patterns they had carefully built over months. To make matters worse, I had leapt into the army at the rank of sergeant, a status my fellow sergeants had spent years earning through sweat, discipline, and patience. Their resentment was quiet but unmistakable. I was not, by any stretch, a welcome addition. Throughout my time with the 88th, no enemy aircraft darkened the skies above Swingate, and so I never had the chance to prove the practical worth of radar in front of these skeptical men. The demonstration that might have won them over never came, yet history would vindicate the technology soon enough. After I was posted away to my next assignment, the unit distinguished itself in combat. The skill and determination of the Dover anti-aircraft gunners earned favorable mention in official accounts of the Battle of Britain, a recognition that spoke to the courage of those men and, perhaps, to the seeds of radar knowledge that had been quietly planted among them. Dover, it must be said, was genuinely in the front line, not in some figurative sense, but literally, with the French coast shimmering on the horizon and the Luftwaffe's bombers only minutes away. The neighboring Royal Air Force Chain Home radar station bore the full fury of German attacks as the enemy attempted to smash the eyes of Britain's air defense network along with its airfields. High masts that once carried the aerials of the Chain Home installation survived the bombardment and, in a twist of post-war irony, stood for years afterwards as convenient supports for microwave dishes carrying Anglo-French radio links, instruments of peaceful communication rising from the wreckage of war. As a posting, Dover was profoundly melancholy. The radar site sat atop the white cliffs, exposed to every mood of the English Channel. Sea mists rolled in without warning, swallowing the landscape in a cold, damp shroud, while the mournful bellowing of lighthouses on land and lightships offshore echoed day and night like the groaning of restless ghosts. Below the cliffs, a cable railway clanked ceaselessly as it hauled coal down to the port, its metallic rhythm blending with the bleating of sheep that wandered the cliff-top fields in huddled, rain-soaked flocks. It was an atmosphere designed to press upon the spirit, a place where the grandeur of the chalk cliffs was constantly undercut by fog, noise, and the inescapable awareness that the enemy was watching from the far shore. Against this grim backdrop, one event carved itself into memory with unusual vividness. King George VI visited the site, arriving in the immaculate dress of a field marshal, every button gleaming, every crease precise. He inspected the radar set, while my operators and I stood at our positions inside the equipment cabin, and he mentioned that Mr. Watson Watt had already explained the principles of the system to him. There was something exhilarating about standing in the presence of the sovereign, a fleeting brush with the very pinnacle of the nation for which we were fighting. Yet before the king could truly settle into conversation, or I could summon the courage to speak, an air raid alarm shrieked across the camp, and he was hustled away by his escort with brisk, unyielding efficiency. It turned out to be a false alarm, nothing more than nerves and a phantom blip. Who knows what might have passed between us had fate allowed another minute? All of this unfolded in early 1940, during those strange suspended months before the full weight of the war crashed down upon Britain. My next posting carried me to the tiny settlement of Hoo, near Rochester in Kent, a place so small it felt almost like a Chinese village dropped into the English countryside. There, a school had been established for the training of radar operators, and I joined a team of instructors who had been assembled since before the war itself had begun. It was a peculiar existence. The conflict was now raging in deadly earnest. From Hoo, I could see the smoke rising from the fires at Dunkirk, a dark column smeared across the horizon like a bruise on the sky. Fighters streaked overhead performing victory rolls, their engines roaring in defiant celebration, while the radio delivered bulletin after bulletin of catastrophic news. The dissonance was staggering, triumph in the air above, disaster in the reports below. Yet through it all, I kept instructing new radar operators, kept feeding the machine that would eventually help turn the tide. In quieter moments, I wandered into Rochester and Chatham, poking around their ancient streets, grateful for any fragment of normality. 12-hour leaves were standard. Occasionally, a 24-hour pass materialized, and I would seize the chance to go home, however briefly, to remember what ordinary life felt like. Before the Blitz descended upon London and transformed the war into a nightly ordeal of fire and rubble, I received orders transferring me to Scottish Command, and Dover slipped behind me like a dream half remembered. I would not lay eyes on the place again until 1945, and when I did, I was staggered by what had been built in the vicinity of Swingate Camp during the years of my absence. Vast constructions, fortifications, and installations that spoke of a war effort on a scale I could scarcely have imagined back in those early fumbling days of 1940. But that transformation, and the stories buried within it, belongs to someone else's telling. My own chapter of the radar secret closes here, at the threshold of a Scotland I had never seen, carrying with me the invisible knowledge that would follow me for the rest of the war and, in truth, for the rest of my life.